everyone. In this video, we're going to look at the economic, political, and social trends of the 1970s that are better known under the umbrella ideas of deindustrialization or deurbanization. In May 1970, in the aftermath of the Kent State Massacre, local New York activists began a funeral procession and protest in honor of one of the dead students from Long Island, Jeffrey Miller. In a show of support for these students, who were primarily students of the anti-war movement, New York City Mayor John Lindsay ordered all flags to be lowered to half-staff on May 8th. That morning, several hundred anti-war protesters gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange to protest the ongoing war in Vietnam and military research on college campuses. They were joined by several hundred other protesters from the city, like high school students and teachers, that brought their numbers closer to 1,000. At lunchtime, hundreds of construction workers converged on the anti-war protesters. Our mix of construction workers weren't necessarily all in favor of the war. We have to remember that a lot of people drafted to Vietnam were of the same blue-collar background as many of these men, so some of them weren't necessarily strictly pro-war. But what we know is that since at least the Goldwater campaign of 1964, Republicans had been working to galvanize the working class and white American men under a large umbrella of patriotism and nationalism to cut across class lines. And so this is what we're starting to see happen here, because at least some of the men who were angry at the protesters weren't angry that they were anti-war, but rather that they were doing things like desecrating the flag. And so when this group of construction workers arrived, they're outnumbered essentially 2-1. And at first, a small line of New York police officers try to keep the two groups separate, but there just simply aren't enough of them. And so the construction workers break through and start attacking the protesters. And even though they're outnumbered, they're attacking a peaceful protest with things like hard hats and construction equipment, hammers, metal pipes, etc. In the end, about a quarter of the major injuries reported were women. Some of the young protesters were beaten entirely unconscious. Only one of the construction workers was even arrested. President Nixon was in a bit of a tough spot after this. He couldn't just ignore the protesters and what happened to them. Apart from the fact that no politician can ignore the votes of young people entirely, this group was extremely vocal against him in a way that could do real political damage. When thousands of protesters arrived in Washington, D.C. the next day for a protest, he went out among them at the Lincoln Memorial in the early morning for nearly 2 hours to try and talk with individuals and diffuse the situation. In individual conversations, he tried to defend the U.S. movement into Cambodia as moving towards his and their ultimate goal of peace. When it came to the construction workers, and more importantly the unions they represented, he met with nearly 24 labor leaders at the White House. They presented him with honorary hard hats and a variety of other small tokens. Nixon told those leaders that he would continue to fight for people like them who, quote, still have character and guts and a bit of patriotism, end quote. Nixon was treading a fine line here, part of a strategy long in the making. When he couldn't risk further alienating anti-war protesters, he was also working hard to win the votes of blue-collar workers who had for years voted solidly for the Democratic Party. A large part of the reason blue-collar workers began to move away from the Democratic Party had to do with their jobs. We know that in the post-World War II era, cities in the U.S. are booming with industrial productivity, especially in areas that manufacture things that are useful in terms of technology and weapons. But what we start to gradually see is that corporate management begins to pull away from industrialized urban centers for manufacturing, and labor leaders and unions begin to lose power. And this happens for a number of reasons, which I'll cover here really in no particular order. First, companies begin exploring new technologies and automation in their processes. I think a lot of times we assume that anytime there's an opportunity to automate something, a company will adopt that really quickly. But there's a lot of reasons not to do that. For example, companies can sometimes get a lot of political pull with local government officials by employing large numbers of their constituents. Once they start laying people off, they lose some of that pull. Another reason is that sometimes these new automation techniques aren't necessarily more efficient. Machinery breaks, and when it does, you have to hire a person to fix it anyway. So companies have to balance the idea of having a person do the work and inspect it to make sure it's correct versus having a machine do it and hope that it's right every time. But one of the reasons companies do like automation is that it gives them more control over their employees. They're able to cut costs in one area, which can justify cutting costs in another, like certain groups' wages. And if they threaten to go on strike or bring their union bosses in, then the company can, in theory, just threaten to replace them with machines. So, in this way, we can see how labor and union leaders begin to lose a bit of their power in this dynamic that's held steady since at least the New Deal era. And when Democrats in Congress and the executive branch don't exactly back them up, they're understandably upset. Another reason companies move towards automation is to comply with the new laws. In 1970, President Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, which created an administration for ensuring basic safety provisions in the American workplace. And since tons of companies had old and dangerous equipment that they couldn't pass the standards of this law with, the new equipment that they replaced it with in order to comply was often equipment that could also automate some aspects of the work. Automation also ensured that less injuries would occur, which would look good on inspection because less people would be actively touching the equipment to begin with. The second reason companies pulled away from urban centers was because they literally just moved away. This is known as Rust Belt Sun Belt movement. If you look at the image here, the line in the middle is the 37th parallel, which is the Sun Belt. States along and below this belt are where families tended to move to and through during the 60s and 70s. The Rust Belt, seen here in red, is where people typically moved from. What's happening is that the Sun Belt states offered corporate leaders cheap or tax-reduced land and the promise of laws that reduced labor unions to essentially nothing. And if you're a CEO of a company, this is great for you. In the 60s and 70s, we also have a ton of new companies coming in from other countries, and this is a really attractive offer for them too. So existing companies and new companies close shop and move. And those that are left behind aren't really able to just stay and continue manufacturing as they are because they've been dependent upon a system where the infrastructure is close together. So they either have to pay to completely rehaul their systems or go under. To give you an example of what this looks like practically, historian A.K. Sandoval Strauss notes that over the course of the 1970s, Chicago lost about 1,900 factories. Between 1972 and 1978 alone, it lost over 118,000 jobs. In 1970, the Ford Motors plant that opened up in 1925 shut down, taking $17.5 million in payroll with it. In 1971, the Dallas Cowboys moved out of the Cotton Bowl in Dallas's Fair Park to Texas Stadium in the suburb of Irving. In 1974, the new DFW airport was built well outside of the actual city of Dallas. So in terms of push-pull factors here, the thing that's pulling people to the Sun Belt region is primarily jobs, which shouldn't be surprising because jobs are always the pull factor for pretty much all migration, although what those jobs look like differ. In this case, a lot of the jobs are in what we now call the military-industrial complex, so companies that are fueling the Cold War effort in terms of technology and research, companies like today's Texas Instruments, Raytheon, and so on. People are also moving here because this is where the housing is. Although the two things are clearly tied, they build housing where the jobs are. A lot of what used to be sharecropping land is now being bought up by real estate developers and turned into massive neighborhoods for new families. So when you drive by a neighborhood with some cutesy name like Something Farms, it literally might have used to be farms at some point. The thing pushing people out of the Rust Belt region is really partially their own racism. We know that between World War I and World War II, tons of African Americans moved north in the respective Great Migrations. This means more than ever, cities like Chicago, New York City, and Detroit, just to name a few, now have flourishing Black communities. In the 20s, this is largely what contributed to the Harlem Renaissance that gave us amazing outpourings of new music, art, and literature. But in the 50s, racist white people didn't want to live with or near these Black communities, so they picked up and left to go, ironically really, to the South or the Sun Belt, where they could live in their segregated, spaced out neighborhoods. This isn't to say that the North didn't have Jim Crow racism to insulate white people from minority communities. That was totally still a thing. But remember, even though racism has always existed in all parts of this country, structural racism was at least slightly more overt and obvious in the legal structures of the South. When people leave these states in droves and new people don't move in, especially people in the middle and upper classes, the businesses that are there to employ people eventually shut down. This includes a lot of those larger factories and industrial plants who had been there essentially since the Gilded Age in the 20s, including some of our car manufacturers. This is what happens in Flint, Michigan. And once they leave, people are left without jobs and end up in poverty, and so the rest of the city really starts to fall apart, hence rust. The problem is that as things fall apart further and further, it becomes harder and harder to convince new people to move there. Who wants to move to a city that's falling apart? Nobody. And so the people who can leave do. The people who can't leave are stuck there. And then because everything is falling apart, the property values plummet. And there's no tax base to support things like schools, which means that now the children aren't getting the things that they need in order to be successful. So now the students graduating from high school don't have the tools to go out and become successful, and they get stuck. Wash, rinse, repeat. And the people who are left in these Rust Belt areas are overwhelmingly minority communities. And then when they fall into a cycle of poverty and ask the government for assistance because the tax base has fallen out from under them due to this massive migration and other things, that's really simplifying it a lot, the government tends to respond that it's not their job to provide aid because that's a state or local issue, except that the state and local governments can't help either because they're dependent upon the taxpayers who are asking for help. Now, it's not entirely fair or accurate to say that this is completely a race-based issue, because it's not. It's also an economic issue that cuts across racial lines, because there are tons of poor white people who live in the Rust Belt region who stay in these regions in the same position. But as we've seen with labor and economic issues since the Gilded Age and even before that, politicians have spent generations telling poor white people that their identity is primarily wrapped up in their race, despite the fact that they likely have more in common with non-white people of similar economic classes. And so between these racial groups continue the general prevalence of Jim Crow, which actively works against their ability to stabilize and grow economically or forge any political alliances that might forcefully advocate for their position on a national stage. I know this to be true even beyond historical evidence because I was born and raised in one of these communities myself on the outskirts of Detroit. The third and for us final reason that companies left the cities was that it was literally just easier to. The Interstate Highway Act, passed by Eisenhower in 1956, made way for well-constructed roads across the nation. And so as the transportation of goods became more dependent on long-haul trucking, corporate leaders could place factories essentially anywhere that they could find adequate roads. This goes hand in hand with the movement to the Sun Belt, which, as you can see here, had no shortage of connecting highways. Now, this wasn't the only reason for the Interstate Highway Act. Eisenhower also pushed for the IHA because he wanted to have a system of roads that were controlled by the federal government and stretched across the entire country in case of disaster. Because if you think about it, they were living in an intense time of fear that at any point the USSR might drop a giant bomb on the United States. And so if they needed to deploy troops or emergency workers or somebody to a city in the country, they needed the ability to do that quickly. And at any point, they didn't have the ability to do that, or at least at that point. So with the Interstate Highway Act, the federal government has the ability to shut down the highways in the case of an emergency to move FEMA or the National Guard or anyone else without interruption and as fast as they need to. All federal highways are even wide enough to land a plane on if they need to. In some ways, this was both a cause and effect of general economic prosperity coming out of the Second World War. The highway system ended up costing $119 billion as of 1996, but didn't add to the national debt. As a Republican dedicated to ensuring that the size and spending of the government remained small, he insisted that his project be self-liquidating or self-funding, to put it another way. To do this, Congress set up a system where states would pay for parts of the roads as they built it with loans from the federal government, but then those loans would be paid back through excise taxes on gasoline by drivers on the roads. They were able to do all of this because coming out of World War II, we were in a really stable financial position to essentially loan ourselves money. The interstate highway system also created economic prosperity because it created economic growth. In addition to creating jobs for people actually building the roads, it led to new businesses popping up all around the highway. Just like we saw businesses in towns popping up along the Transcontinental Railroad during the Gilded Age, the 50s and 60s saw all kinds of new businesses like mini marts, new gas stations, fast food places, and motels pop up all around the interstates. And all of these things created jobs and new revenue streams for people. It's impossible to talk about the interstate highway without discussing the absolute devastation it had on Black and brown communities, though. These images above are taken from the same neighborhood in Detroit about a decade apart. As you can see, in order to build the highway, the federal government used the constitutional power of eminent domain to demolish entire neighborhoods after forcefully removing the residents without really anywhere else to go. Beginning in the New Deal era, the Federal Housing Authority added to segregation efforts by saying that certain groups of people could be denied mortgages if they were considered a financial risk. To determine who was a risk and who wasn't, the Homeowners Loan Court, or HOLC, drew up color-coded maps that were then adopted by the FHA. Any area where African Americans lived or lived near was coded in red and denied mortgages, a policy referred to as redlining. The Federal Housing Authority's own underwriting manual, which they use to determine who gets a mortgage and not, said that constructing highways to separate Black and white neighborhoods was a useful strategy as, quote, incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live within the same communities, end quote. And so when highways were built that obliterated Black and brown communities, they were provided with money from the government as required by the rules of eminent domain. But many literally had nowhere to go. There were no homes for them to rent or buy because they weren't allowed to live in certain places until HOLC created updated maps that opened up new areas. While redlining was found illegal and written out of law with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, we can still see the effects of this today. On the right is the same map of the Detroit area with the percentage of people of color as 2019 with the HOLC grade overlaid. What's obvious here is that Black and brown communities spread into areas that were formerly yellow or, quote, moderate risk areas. And the white people in those areas left for suburbs further away from the city. And areas that were predominantly communities of color have remained that way today. The Carter administration focused on reform in banking and credit policies surrounding redlining. The purpose of the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, in 1977 is to reverse a lot of this. The idea was that if banks had largely created the process of redlining and the problems associated with it, they'd have to be the ones to help rectify that problem. This law doesn't specifically require banks to give loans to specific people or groups or communities of people, but it does give banks a CRA rating based on who they are lending to. So if a bank refuses to give equitable loans and then they want to turn around and ask the government for a bailout later or for permission to do a merger or something else, they can be denied for that. Essentially, the government says that they don't have to follow these rules, but if they ever think that they'll want anything from the government, which they definitely will, it's in their best interest to. Which is why you hear all the time now that banks will advertise themselves as things like a, quote, equal opportunity lender and such. Starting really in the mid-60s, arguably the biggest fiscal problem faced by Nixon, Ford, and Carter was stagflation. This is a term used to describe an economic condition where you have both high unemployment and high inflation. So the economy is essentially stagnant, hence stagflation. The OPEC oil embargo only added to this problem in the early 70s by adding to inflation. Ford tried to solve the problem by limiting government spending and cutting the money supply to decrease the inflation part at least. This didn't work. By the time Carter came into office, the unemployment rate of 7.4% wasn't even necessarily the biggest issue. In addition to that, the US started running massive trade deficits and the value of American exports dropped, while the price of its imports went way up. Plus, there was the lingering economic turmoil caused by the conflicts in Vietnam and with OPEC. In response to all of this and the overarching stagflation issue, Carter tried to expand the money supply again, essentially reversing Ford's decision, but this made inflation skyrocket again. The Federal Reserve decided to dial back the money supply again, which then led to increases in unemployment up to over 10%. Carter then tried to deregulate some businesses, mostly transportation and banking, thinking that perhaps the competition between them would drive economic growth. This seemed to make the business owners happy, but actively hurt consumers, especially those who depended on the services in more rural areas. One of the things that deindustrialization and white flight show us really clearly is the very clear connection between economic, social, and political trends. None of these things happen on their own or in a vacuum. They work as a system that depend on each other.